what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Ballistic Banter, episode 3. Boys, how are we feeling?
Ready to go.
Tommy?
It's going to be a fun day. It's going to be a very fun day.
We got an awesome topic. But first, quick shout out to Mr. Matthew Miner, setting up the new studio. This place is looking freaking sick, man. I've got a bunch of decorations that have been added. I got my M20 Super Bazooka from Vietnam.
Which we will be wall mounting.
Well, it will be wall mounted for sure. Got some pegboards that are coming, so we're going to be mounting some rifles. So, Matt, dude, you killed it.
Yep, thank you. Appreciate it. Got a nice little pistol rack.
Studio looks great.
Eventually, I'll be able to offer you a nice cold beverage with the kegerator.
Yeah, dude, the keg fridge. Bro, I was looking at that thing earlier. We need to fill that up. You're like an 8 or 5 keg.
We're going to be filling it up probably before next episode. So, feel you ready to go.
Stay when
it.
And done there. Yep. So, yeah, good job on the studio, man. This is awesome. This is a cool setup. But episode 3, we got an awesome episode. Episode's going to be centered around the Mosin Nagant, and this is going to be more of Tommy's episode since, again, for those of you who didn't see episode 1 or who just don't know, Mr. Ian McCollum Jr., Tommy, take it away, brother.
Well, somebody has to know exactly what guns you're buying because Garrett over here has had the rifle in front of him for 7 years, didn't know what it was, and I can't wait to be out there tomorrow
It's
because
not that
I will slap him.
I didn't know what it was. I knew it was a Mosin. I just didn't know the specific type that it was.
Garrett,
If it walks like Mosin,
Garrett, God,
what is it? Yeah, I get it.
Garrett, God gave you a brain and 2 thumbs. You could have done a quick search, you lazy man.
I could have, but guess what, Tommy?
It's also on the top of the gun, too. So,
You know what? That's right.
Well,
It should tell me everything I need to know.
Tommy, why don't you go ahead and break it down? What kind of Mosin this is? I think it's pretty
Yeah,
special.
tell us about it, Tommy.
So the gun that Garrett has in particular is actually it's an American-made Mosin Nagant by the New England Westinghouse company, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But the name Mosin Nagant it's kind of accurate, but it's also not. It's complicated. Russian firearm history is very weird, but to the Russians, at least when this gun was first adopted, it was known as the 3-line rifle model of 1891, and you're going to hear me reference a couple things throughout the episode just for basic understanding. Things like a line or an arshin are old Russian imperial units of measurement that are basically built off the distances between like points of the body to the end of the forearms and things like that. So a line, I think, is 2.5 centimeters. And an arshin is something equivalent to like a walking pace, things like that. I'll explain a little bit of that.
Tommy, I'm not gonna lie, brother. You're kind of losing me. You said these are imperial measurements that the Russians used.
Yeah, so before there was the Soviet Union, there was Imperial Russia. The Tsars, Nicholas and the Tsarina, soon to be Rasputin, our favorite non-dying Russian mystic.
Right, Matt? Sure. Go ahead.
Well, but this is important, at least for your rifle, because your sights will bring up closer images of this later on. Your sights are actually the original sights. Well, not the original, but the old sights that these things would have been adopted and marked in when the gun was first introduced into Russian service back in the 1890s. And this gun is basically like the tail end of, I would say, about 10 years of Russian development, because a couple of wrenches got thrown into the works. But to make this dramatically simple, back in the 1870s, firearms technology was going through a lot of rapid iteration. You had new lever actions coming out in the Americas, so things like the Winchester 1866, 73, things like that. You had countries all over the world moving from muzzle loading rifles to single shot bolt actions, or just single shot breech loading rifles in particular. So in Britain, you had the Martini. In Austria-Hungary, you had the Tabernacle gun, the Verndl, something I'd love to talk about later on. Matt, I know you want me to talk about that gun soon enough.
Which one?
We will, don't worry.
Tabernacle rifle.
Yeah, you lost me on that, man.
Literal divine inspiration.
We'll get you back. It's okay.
But again, another gun for another day. And in Russia, they had what was called the Berdan II, invented by U.S. Civil War veteran Hiram Berdan. There are a lot of American Hiram inventors who invented guns for other nations. I find that quite interesting. If I had a nickel for every time it happened, I'd only have 2, but it's still interesting that it happened.
Can you name me one other?
Hiram Maxim, baby.
The Maxim gun, you got me there. That's what I was thinking of. All right, you got
Hiram Stevens Maxim. But anyway, Anyway, so the Russians had the Berdan II in service with them, and then during one of their many conflicts with the Ottoman Turks, there's a battle known as the Siege of Plevna, and what happens is the Ottomans there end up holding out for far longer than they reasonably should. And part of the reason for it is when the Russians would close towards the Ottoman lines, there were Ottoman gunners who were using Winchester 1866 lever actions. And I'm going to try to dumb this down as quickly as I can. This is long before you have quick change box magazines that people are carrying 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 at a time like we have nowadays. In this situation, the whole idea of having a magazine was not so much for fast reloading, but it was for a short period of an increase in firepower, because testing would later show that if I have a gun that shoots 1 round for every time I work the action by loading it by hand versus a tube loader, the number of shots is equal over the same span of time, whether I'm mag dumping a lever action from its tube mag or I'm just loading 1 round at a time. But a lot of countries basically wanted a gun that could do both. They would have a magazine with a cutoff held in reserve, but you could still single load it and fire it in a line. And so by the 1880s, you have the Mauser 7184, you have the British testing things like the what would become the Lee Enfield. America's behind on this curve because, well, we don't fight anybody at this point, so there's really no reason for us to stay up to date with small arms technology. And the Russians are toying with converting their Berdans to having a lever action, or having a tube magazine, And lo and behold, what happens is they have a chain detonation in the magazine because having center fire cartridges tipped to primer, shaking the gun around, especially back in the day when the primers were terrible, that recoil would then send the primer of one into the tip of another, the gun would explode. So the Russians said, no more tubes. So in steps our hero, Sergei Mosin. You see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
So Mosin is toying and and trying to build up these new rifles for the Russian army to adopt. And by 1886, the Russians are on the verge of adopting his model 1885 gun. It looks good, it feeds well, it's semi-reliable, and the Russians they're happy with what the gun's going to be, and they're like, this is going to be our new service rifle. It's going to be fine. And then in come the French, because basically overnight, small arms technology changes. The French introduced the 1886 Lebel, which is a magazine-fed, small-bore, smokeless powder rifle, which effectively doubled the effective range of firearms overnight. So now the Russians have to scramble. So they axe his 1885 gun, and they basically go to the French and say, hey, look, we're behind on our small arms. Can we just borrow that 8mm Lebel cartridge, barrel, and rear sight? And that's essentially what they do when they're developing what becomes the Mosin Nagant. But they make some tweaks. So first they look at the cartridge and they say, this thing is terrible. So they go down to, they were going to do a 3.5 line cartridge, which would have been about 8mm, so similar to 8mm Mauser, 8mm Lebel, things like that. But they wanted to go a little smaller, so they go down to flat 3 line, which is 7.62, Russia's favorite diameter of everything.
7.62. All of them. Except for
we'll talk about that later. you sick, filthy man. Don't worry. But they go down to what would eventually become the 7.62 by 54R. And they did some testing with a rimless case, or what we would know as rimless, but they found that in, operating the gun and gas sealing and extracting things like that, rimmed cartridges were better. But the problem the Russians are having is they still don't know what kind of magazine they want, because they don't want a tube. They're toying with the idea of going to some type of a center stack charger, but they haven't been able to develop anything in-house. Well, then in steps the other hero to this equation, which is a man by the name of, they're the two brothers, actually. There's Emil Nagant and Leon Nagant. They are Belgian firearms manufacturers, and I want to just tell this quick aside because I love this story. All in all, the Nagant brothers are based out of Belgium. They'd be one of the founding members of Fabrique Nationale, FN Herstal. But before they got there, I'd love to do an episode on some of their guns, but before they got their start making things for FN, they were just small in-house rifle and pistol makers. Well, the funny thing is the first commercial rifle that they were selling to both militaries and to civilians was the Remington rolling block. They had met the Remington brothers, who were trying to establish a foothold in Europe. They walk in to Nagant's factory, they offer him the rolling block and license to produce it, and their first contract was a contract for 10 or 15,000 rolling blocks for the Papal States in 1868, which I think is just kind of a funny aside that the first rifle contract these guys would ever do was for a bunch of Catholics in Rome. But that's just one of my favorite asides. But back to the Mosin story. Nagant is trying really hard to get his own rifle adopted by the Russians, and he introduces this straight pull magazine-fed repeater that the Russians really, they don't jump on board completely. They love the magazine concept, but they don't like the bolt system. They don't like the straight pull for whatever reason. They just said, Nagant, we don't want it. So Nagant goes back and he creates a turn bolt system similar to what the Mosin has, and they introduce the magazine. Well, now that the magazine has also been introduced into the Russian arsenal system, Mosin gets his hands on it and he starts playing around with it and tweaking it, which I'll come back to this in a second. But so by the time the gun is almost ready for wholesale adoption, between all the work that Mosin's done on the bolt system and everything, all the work that the commission has done with the rifle, the cartridge, and things like that, now Mosin has also made upgrades to the magazine that Nagant has introduced. So in 1891, under Tsar Alexander III, the Mosin Nagant is finally adopted. The Russians are on board. But this creates a little bit of a problem with Leon Nagant, because he had a contract signed with the Russians that if they adopted his rifle, he would give them rights to produce for 200,000 rubles. The problem was there was no stipulation in that contract for the magazine. And international patent law at this time is very, very weird, especially if you're doing something within your own country. So the Russians were trying to get out of paying this guy for even the patent for his magazine, if you can even call it his anymore by this point. But the problem is one of the places they had contract to produce the rifle to get everything tooled up was Châtellerault in France, one of the French state arsenals. And because Nagant had patented his technology in France, he could sue the Russian government in France. And the Russians eventually had to pay this guy 200,000 rubles regardless, just because they were trying to play games with him and have their cake and eat it too. But again, even by this point, I don't really think you could call the Mosin magazine or the Nagant magazine Nagant's anymore, because Mosin had made so many updates to it. It was almost his own ideas between the way it could be removed from the gun, the extra springs, the updated follower. So it's one of those things where, is it really Nagant's gun anymore at this point?
Probably not.
Not really. But that's also now why we know this gun in the West as the Mosin Nagant, is because Nagant made such a big deal in the world press that the Russians were trying to, give him the short end of the stick in order to manufacture his magazine system. So that's why we in the West now know this as the Mosin Nagant. No Russian soldier ever really knew it as that, at least at the time it was adopted. They just knew it as the 3-line rifle model of 1891. And that's also something I want to make very clear here right now. For those who have actually shot any variation of the Mosin, whether it's an old World War I gun, a M44, a 9130, or a Finnish or a Chinese, you either love it or you hate it. And you look at the gun in such a way that it's like, this gun seems terrible. Why did anybody use this? Well, it's not something that came out for World War II. It was around 30, 40 years prior to it. And when you stop and consider that, the Mosin and all of its features actually make a lot of sense. And there are a couple I want to talk about, and don't worry, we'll have photographs of a lot of these things that I'm going to talk about when I get into them later on. But the first I want to talk about is that bolt system. And Garrett, I know you and I had talked about it a little bit today, but so on that bolt system for the Mosin is kind of like this old world meets new. So one of the requirements that the Russians had when they were designing this gun is that you could not use the locking lugs as your bolt stop, which meaning like and for those who don't understand what I'm talking about, the way the bolt is retained in the gun is in something like, say, this 1891 Carcano that I have, or any iteration of like a Mauser 98, there's a catch in the back of the receiver that the bolt's locking lugs will stop on in order to keep it in the gun. Well, the Russians didn't want that because if you rack the bolt hard repeatedly on the gun, you're going to eventually damage the locking lugs. Of course, the workaround is you just heat treat your gun properly. They're not going to deform. But the Russians were paranoid about that. So Mosin introduces this full-length rail system that actually now catches on the sear in order to prevent the locking lugs from acting as the bolt stop. And the sear in this rail also serves a secondary function, which to me is one of the worst parts about the thing that makes the Mosin bolt so terrible. That's why everybody complains about the weird bolt throw and just the gumminess of the action, is on the back end of the gun, it retains the cocking piece in such a way that there will not be an out-of-battery detonation. Basically, like, you don't want your cocking piece rotating when the gun's out of battery if there's a live cartridge on it, because if it does, the primer's going to fall, or the firing pin's going to fall, hit the primer, and you're going to have a very bad day. Let's just put it that way. And so the workaround to that was just extending this rail all the way to the back. So now you can't actually have an out-of-battery rotation, which was one of the things that was actually very common on a lot of early smokeless repeaters in this period. You'd see these problems on the Gewehr 88. The early Mauser 1899 and Ottoman 1890, but Mauser had a workaround for that as well. Not so much on this Carcano here. I'm going to reference this a little bit in the episode as kind of a comparison, because this gun also came out the same year that the Mosin did. Mine's actually also an original. It was manufactured in 1899. It's just been shortened a little bit, but it still has the original World War I rear sight, which I think is really cool. But anyway, so that was one of the big concerns that the Russians had. The other concern that the Russians had, when it was also another thing that came down to the ammo, and what terrified them was having double feeds. And this problem plagued the German Gewehr 88 for a long time, and actually caused a very bad scandal in their arms industry. I'll touch on that in a later episode if we ever cover it. But basically, what would happen is you would have German soldiers who would go to work the action of their Gewehr 88, and they'd start to throw one into the chamber, but for whatever reason, they wouldn't bolt all the way forward, which means the round would not lip under the extractor. So then they pull the bolt back, now realize that the round is in there, and they go to bolt forward again, pick up a new cartridge. Well, now you have a round tipped to primer with a round in the chamber already, so that pressure is now even more compacted, and you had a lot of guns explode. Well, there are a few ways that you can work around this in order to prevent this from happening. My Carcano, and I'll flash pictures of this as well, have one of the more easy workarounds, and this is something that Paul Mauser would adopt on his 1893, 95, and 98 future 98 models. But what you do is you don't make it a full bolt face in order to preserve gas seal. You cut away the bottom half of the bolt that would retain the rim of the cartridge. So when you bolt forward, that cartridge gets picked up and then lips under the extractor. Well, the Russians went for something a little bit different. The Russians decided that in order to have a dedicated controlled feed on their Mosins, what they did is they added a cartridge interrupter in the magazine. And a lot of people don't realize that this is there, and they question why these rounds will ever do this. But the way it is it's a spring piece of sheet metal that when the rounds are depressed into the magazine, one round will always be at the top of it so it can be picked up by the bolt and put into the chamber. But until that bolt goes all the way home and locks, the bolt actually has to come all the way down and lock into action. That will then depress a spring on the opposite side of that piece of metal to pop the next round up. That way, there is never going to be a chance for the Mosin round in the mag you'll never have a double feed on a Mosin, which is rather impressive. It seems weird to us now, pay attention, don't bolt forward on a gun that hasn't picked up the round on the extractor yet. But the Russians wanted to over-engineer the solution to that problem. And to me, that is one of the things that I find most interesting about the Mosin. But again, in hindsight, it makes a lot of sense why they did it. It just seems ridiculous to us that they did it at all. And this is something that all Mosin Nagants have from the early 1891s, like Garrett has, all the way to the Mosins that the Chinese would be manufacturing in the 50s. It's just an integral part of the system.
So, Tommy, you're telling me that this thing physically cannot double feet around, right? Because of that envelope feature from the bolt to the magazine.
Yep.
That's
because of the way it's set up. And, of course, this problem could... And, of course, these double feeds could even become even more dangerous about the turn of the 20th century when people started going over to Spitzer cartridges, because that point would be even easier to depress a primer.
Oh, for sure.
But
Last
still,
thing I would want is a gun blowing up in my face, and it seems like that was a pretty common theme, especially with the tube-fed firearms that they were using to the ones that they were using before this.
You know, and it's one of those things where it's it would not be fun, but it's one of those things where it's the price you pay for experimenting with new technology. These guns were highly experimental, but everybody was trying to get to that cutting edge to be better than your adversary, so that you didn't have to be at a technological disadvantage already. I mean, heck, the Mosins were so concerned about, or the Russians were so concerned about a war breaking out in the time they were developing the Mosin, that if the magazine system wasn't ready, they were just going to start producing single-shot smokeless powder rifles and worry about the magazine later. Like, that's where they were.
Idea compared to what they did.
But would you rather have a gun that's getting outranged by your opponent, or just outshot? Because this is Russia we're talking about, so you just field double, triple the men, and you triple your fire rate from a single-shot rifle. Again, Russian thinking is very weird. Not to mention, especially the Russians, especially at this time, were very, very stingy, which will lead me to my next point of why the Mosin never goes away. Because the Russians basically equipped their entire army by about the end of the 1890s, so about 1900, 1901. The all Russian frontline troops are now equipped with the Mosin Nagant, which was never always the case. In some of their previous conflicts, they were using a complete mishmash of old and up-to-date rifles. You could get a Berdan, or you could get one of the old Krinka conversion rifles, and you'd be kind of shit out of luck at that point. But again, Russia didn't want to spend the money to properly equip their infantry, so, it's one of those things. But to that point, the Mosin's first action is going to be in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, where they come up against the Japanese 6.5 Type 30 Arisaka. And the Arisaka is a very interesting rifle in and of itself. It has a lot of weird features, but the Japanese outright win that conflict. But the funny thing is even though they hands down slapped the Russians in every way that matters, on land and at sea, the Japanese look at their Type 30 and they're like, we can make this better. And then you get the Type 38, what eventually evolves to the Type 99, which is one of the best bolt-action systems ever. Well, the Russians stick with the Mosin. They make a few updates to the sling swivel attachments and the handguard, and that's really it. They could have gone for better, but they chose not to. Why? Because it's expensive to equip 4 million men with
Tommy,
with rifles.
Remind me again, which model of the Arisaka does your family member have?
So my family member has a Type 99. So this is kind of like the last development.
Nice.
But to make it very easy, so a Type 99 is a Type 38. The only thing that really separates it is the cartridge. The Type 38 and the Type 30 are in a 6.5 by 50 millimeter casing, whereas the Type 99 is in Japanese 7.7 millimeter. They were just trying to get more power out of a rifle round, because even like this, my Carcano also 6.5, they were very common in the 1890s when they were being developed, because no Spitzer cartridges were invented yet. And they found that you could get just as much damage on target with a smaller diameter projectile just by shooting it faster. So that's why you have a lot of countries that start adopting these 6.5 cartridges. But the funny thing about the Mosin is the Russians' penny pinching comes back to haunt them, because they wind up the arsenals during the Russo-Japanese War, and then they wind them down again. And they're like, oh, we'll have enough. I mean, how many rifles could we ever really need in event of a massive conflict? Well, World War I breaks out, and the Russians start hemorrhaging rifles. This is an armed force who by 1915 has 1 million men under arms without rifles, and their Minister of War declares that rifles are more valuable than gold.
They prefer to go
So
fist
they-
to fist. They don't need the rifles. Rifle? What? I don't even know what that means.
Pick up the rifle of your dead comrade.
If you
It,
drop
no,
it,
literally,
you
it's,
pick
it's
it up.
literally, it's literally enemy at the gates. It's like,
Yeah.
one of you will be issued with rifle. If he dies, man behind
Man
picks up
behind,
the rifle.
Pick up the rifle.
God, what a terrible
What
way
an
that would.
iconic line. What a shitty spot
one
to
of
be
the-
in, though.
Yeah.
Either
Fantastic movie.
Either way, being that first person to get smoked and drop the rifle, or you're behind them and you pick up that rifle and you're thinking, shit, now it's my turn.
Yeah, and then you're gonna
That
get smoked,
sucks.
and then you're gonna get smoked by an MG34 anyway.
Yeah.
So it didn't matter. But this is, so this whole situation though with the Russians in World War I is where Garrett's rifle sitting on the table comes into play. So 1915, the Russians are absolutely they're running out of equipment. They're getting hammered on the front. They have little artillery ammunition, and they don't have guns. They just simply don't have guns. So they go everywhere. They buy Arasakas from the Japanese. They buy old school Italian Vetterli Vitali rifles that are still in 10.4 millimeter black powder cartridges. I mean, they're that desperate for guns. But at the same time, they go over to the United States, like all Entente forces did, in order to contract with their firearms manufacturers for more guns. They buy 300,000 Winchester lever-action guns in 1895 for those who have played Battlefield. Fantastic scout class
That was
weapon.
by far my favorite weapon in Battlefield 1. By far.
Mm-hmm. And those are real guns. They're very hard, very expensive to find today, but they have Mosin Nagant stripper clips. They shoot 7.62 by 54R. Another massive pinnacle of innovation by John Browning, our favorite gun inventor.
Our Lord and Savior, John Moses Browning.
Yep. But at the same time, Russia knows they need more standard issue frontline Mosins in order to keep the supplies interchangeable and everything like that. So they go to Winchester and this company, New England Westinghouse, who doesn't really have a lot of experience in the firearms industry. They were always more of an electrical and smaller manufacturing type of company. But they contract Remington and New England Westinghouse in total. Of course, these orders wouldn't be fulfilled due to the Russian Civil War and the communists pulling them out of the fight. But they contracted for about 3.7 million Mosin Nagants. They signed what effectively became two massive contracts, but they were signed in like three separate parts. And by 1917, Westinghouse had been able to crank out about 1.1 million and ship them to Russia. Remington had been able to only ship about 500,000. There's a reason for this. The great irony of Russian guns is they're built to such loose spec. They're very loose on the tolerances. They try to make these as mass producible as possible, but the Russian inspectors were the most nitpicky people ever. I mean, you read the stories about the Winchester rifles, they would send rifles back to the factory because they didn't like the grain of the stocks.
Yeah.
I mean, they were just coming up with reasons to send these guns back. But now the irony of this whole situation is for some reason, Westinghouse got like the cool Chad inspectors who were like, gun is good, the gun is good, the gun is good, it's fine.
Yeah.
Remington, no such luck. That's why their numbers were so low. And so eventually you've got about 1.6 million Mosins built by both companies, shipped over to Russia. And then I think about another 500,000 or so, about 400,000 were built after the Russians pulled out of the contract and the war was starting to grind down because the U.S. didn't want these companies to completely just, collapse, fall apart. So they ended up buying more, which then actually were in turn sold to forces like the White Army under Admiral Alexander, or even the Czech Legion, who decided to stay and fight in the Russian Civil War. If you ever want some fun reading, go look up the Czech Legion. Those guys lived a very, very fun and telling life. And now this also brings me to one other thing about the Mosin that I completely neglected to talk about, but it's my biggest gripe with historical Russian firearms owners, and it has to do with that lovely socket bayonet that Garrett brought with him. So, for those of you who own, say, something like an SKS or a Mosin 9130, and you make the comment that the gun is more accurate with the bayonet attached, I want to dispel something right now, very simply. Mosin Nagants that are 9130 models built by the Soviet Union, and all SKSs do not need the bayonet to be accurate. Also, if you're shooting at under 100 yards, you don't need the bayonet regardless. You should never, ever need more accuracy inside that range. But where this comes from is the Russians, when developing this gun, came up with some weird rationale that fixing the bayonet took far too much time. So, in order to save time in a combat situation, you were just to carry the gun with the bayonet attached at all times. So the guns were sighted with the bayonets attached. And this caused a lot of problems for people who would get Mosins as surplus or aid, like the Serbians and the Latvians during the war, because they'd try to shoot at 150, 250 meters, but they're shooting completely inaccurate, and they could not understand why. Well, the Russians never told anybody that this was the case. But this created this whole situation where now, if you've got a guy with an SKS and an underfolding bayonet, at the range, he'll flip it out and attach it and start shooting a target at 15, 20 yards because he's like, my 7.62 is more accurate. I'm like,
Tommy, you're telling me that by attaching a bayonet or, taking that underfolding bayonet out and, setting that up isn't going to make my grouping sub MLA?
I have,
really?
Well,
It's
first of all,
counterweight,
760 by 39.
It helps me to get the reload and follow shots.
I literally watched a grown man take a Yugoslavian SKS, underfold the bayonet to the barrel, and start mag dumping it at 15, 20 yards. And I am just cringing at this sight. And he turns around and he looks at me. He's like, wait, what's wrong? Why are you making that face? I'm like, why is the bayonet out? He's like, it makes it more accurate. I'm like, sir, I'm gonna have to, because he was shooting my aunt's SKS.
My computer run faster.
Oh my god, dude, you totally should have said something like that just to mess with him, man. I mean, bro, it's absurd. A bayonet makes you shoot accurate.
Like my new chrome rims on my car, it makes it go faster.
But again, Garrett, if that gun you have is completely all original with the barrel and everything else. This is true. If we go out and shoot it this weekend at 250, 300 yards, the gun is not going to shoot straight.
1,000 yards, Tommy.
I don't think
you better buy me.
No, dude, I don't even know. Right?
You better buy me a Mosin PU at that point.
Yeah, no shit, Tommy. This thing is all original barrel. I mean, it's all stamped and matching serials and stuff like that. And I'm sure you'll get into what's bubbaed on this gun, like you always do. But we can get into that.
Well, I'm not prepared to say that I don't want to fully say that it's Bubba, because if it's still all matching, that means it's been preserved. I just want to know why you're missing 10 inches of forestock on the front of the gun.
That's why you're here, Tommy.
Hey, I know.
I was going to say, Tommy,
You're supposed to say
I have never seen a Mosin like that.
Sure,
I
yeah,
have never seen him.
Tommy knows more about my gun than I do, so that's cool.
You can spin it around so you can get the stock close to the camera. Let them decide.
I wanted to put that bayonet on when he was talking about it, but it's so loud. I don't want to mess with this thing either.
Yeah, I will say though that the Mosin
Yeah, does it?
It looks fine now because I'm looking at the.
So now he takes his claim back. Isn't that something magical? Isn't that something magical?
The math ain't
math. He's not here in person, and
the math ain't math.
Tommy.
But my whole point with kind of getting into some of these nitty gritties, especially about like Garrett's Mosin, for example, because again, his has got a lot of the old World War I features. So it's got its old Arshan sights. It still has it was manufactured by New England Westinghouse, which I think is unbelievable. I've been looking for that gun for far too long, you filthy rat.
You're not allowed to touch it.
I can touch it. I can touch it.
Only look, no touch, man. You can touch it. I don't want it.
Tommy, look what I'm doing.
But to me, it's actually kind of funny in the sense of because I had never because I'd always heard of the Mosin. I'd seen them around, like I've shot a handful of them before. I've shot an M44. I've shot a 9130. Of course, any good gun lover has seen Enemy at the Gates. We've all played COD, so we've definitely seen or played the infamous Enemy at the Gates mission in World at War. Oh. So like people, and especially here in the United States, people know the Mosin Nagant. And it's one of those rifles that either you love it or you hate it. And the people who hate it, I think, hate it for all of the wrong reasons. in the sense of they hate them because they think they're newer. The gun is newer than it actually is. Nobody pays attention to the fact that the gun was built in 1891. I mean, that Mosin design is just as old as my Carcano here. And quite frankly, I would almost make the argument that the Mosin is a slightly better system.
You're damn right.
The Carcano in and of itself is beautiful in its simplicity because it's the only thing that Italians were going to be able to produce for themselves. Whereas the Mosin clearly had a lot of care and thought put into it. It's just some of the features seem weird. Whether it's the barrel sighted with the bayonets, that magazine interrupter, or that weird rail on the bolt. I've heard people make the argument that if you were to take that little rail on the bottom of the bolt off...
We'll throw up a picture of that.
Yeah.
Yep. The gun would run so much smoother because
Without
the
that
thing
rail.
because if you look at that bolt as it is, and you take that rail off, it looks almost like any other bolt that you've seen for any other bolt action. I mean, you've got your front locking lugs, you've got your cocking piece at the rear, and you've got your camming surfaces that interact with that bolt system in order for you to cock it and reload the action. But it's that rail that gets in the way because the minute any sort of mud or muck or anything gets into it, the whole system falls apart. Of course, all bolt actions are not going to fare too well with mud, but that Mosin rail especially just causes far too many problems. But at the same time, I want to tip my cap to Sergei Mosin because he developed this system that works really well with what the Russians were trying to accomplish and trying to avoid. And I will say, I much prefer the safety on the Mosin to say something like my Carcano because this gun doesn't even have a safety. It's more of a manual decocker in a sense of I rotate this little piece here and I just kind of move the firing pin down onto a live round. Whereas the Mosin actually has kind of like for those who have ever shot a Swiss Schmidt-Rubin, you actually pull the cocking piece back and rotate it and then let it down and sit on the
Yeah, Tommy, for those of us who have even heard of it, totally, dude.
Oh, yeah, well.
Tommy, can you tell me a little something about these sites, man? You mentioned a little bit about it earlier. I don't truly know how the hell these things work, so enlighten me, brother.
So like I said, so much like the name of the gun 3 line, the sights are it's one of those things where every empire at this time period had its own measuring system. It's completely and utterly ridiculous. And the Russians used this very weird system that was the way it was divided is kind of like in sections of like distances between parts of the human body. So like the Arshin and the line come from the distance between like your shoulder to the tips of your fingers. It's very complicated, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds on it because it's like trying to understand.
It's too much. That's like a foreign language.
Exactly. But so the way it works, like I said, so the line measurement, which is what 7.62x54R is measured in, is 2.54 centimeters, I think, something like that. And then an Arshin, which is what the sights are measured in, is about 80 centimeters. It's something equivalent to like a walking pace. In the sense of like it's a little bit more short range than like measuring in like meters, but it's not the same as a meter. It's not like saying like it's not the same as saying a yard is a meter. There's a little bit of a difference in there.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I'm gonna do a little research before next weekend so I can accurately shoot this thing, or at least sound like I know what I'm talking about when we actually shoot it.
Yeah,
it has to be this weekend.
Yeah, that's what I said.
That's why.
Next weekend.
Oh yeah, because I leave.
This weekend.
Whatever. I forgot.
Well, because that was really the biggest change to what separates a World War I Mosin from a 9130. All the Soviets really did is they just went to a tangent rear sight and they adopted the metric system. Okay. That's all that separates the two guns. And now, if you're lucky enough to find a bunch of Swiss Mosins, those early Swiss model of M28s, Matt, I know you wanted to get into this subject, Mr. I love the White Death.
Tommy, please explain to us, either Matt or Tommy, what that is, because in all honesty, I don't even know what it is.
Matt, I'm gonna let you start off with this, and I'll fill in any gaps if you have them.
Enlighten me, Matt.
Only the most badass sniper to ever walk.
Oh,
Basically.
it's
Yep. So this is when the Russians were they were unprovoked by the Finnish, and they just started trying to invade Finland, and the White Death just said no. Most confirmed kills
Not
of any sniper ever. He basically just laid in the
Simo-
snow.
in history.
Yeah.
What's his number?
Simo,
Do
hey,
you know the number?
560. It's 560 or 540. It's something. It's something in the
yeah,
500s.
It's up there.
What is
It
Badass.
What's
Absolute badass.
it makes some American legends look like they were just at a range
Don't
doing
you
target
dare.
practice.
Don't you dare.
Didn't he have a quote about killing Russians or whatever? I forgot what it was.
Oh, I know what you're talking about, and I
forget if it was
don't
him or not,
remember.
but he basically, when he was being interviewed by somebody, he goes, "So how do you feel, killing all those people?" He goes, "I didn't kill any people. I just killed. I just killed."
No, and the winter war is is one of my favorite conflicts because it highlights the second rule of all warfare. The first being you never invade Russia in the middle of winter, and the second one is you don't mess with the Finns. They are a very angry and well trained bunch.
I wouldn't even say angry. They're just sitting there in the snow, just
In
waiting.
his little crow's nest. Dude, you know what that reminds me of? You ever seen Glorious Bastards? The
Yup.
scene where, it's portrayed in a film inside the movie. When he's mowing down those Russians from that crow's nest. Dude, that's exactly what pops in my mind when I think that White Death did. That's literally the first thing that came up.
So I believe, Tommy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but on Classic, don't they have a Finnish M91 on there, right?
They have a couple 9128. So the one thing I will say is there are a lot of Mosins that exist. You have you have the American made ones, which are just cool because they're classic Americana. Then you've got the Russian made ones, which are they're just as good in some cases. It just depends on what you're trying to find, especially the newer ones like the M44s that were built towards the end of World War II and never really saw combat. Then you have the Chinese one, which, much like the Chinese SKSs, I prefer not to use guns that were made with backyard steel. And then
Two
you
thumbs
have.
down from me, Tommy.
Well done, Emperor Lyle. We appreciate your service to the Coliseum.
I also almost got that Yugo SKS.
That would
Oh,
have been
yeah,
a good
those-
one, too. That would have been a really good one.
Yugo SKSs are some of the best SKSs
I have
ever
a-
made.
I have a
But
Russian
I think they
SKS.
still have it over there down the street.
back
Dude,
to
open it up tomorrow. Look at him. Look, I'm tempting him.
he's thinking about it.
Garrett convinced Matt to go buy a Yugoslavian SKS.
I'm just gonna say,
Matt, there's nothing special about this.
I know.
But
I'm just gonna say one of these episodes. I'm not gonna say a word. I'm not gonna say what the episode's gonna be about.
Bring it up.
I'm going to just silently bring it up
Oh my
under
God.
the table, and you guys are gonna have a raw reaction
Matt.
to whatever I get.
Every time one of us gets a new gun, that's exactly what we should do.
I'll do it.
well, I'm
Dude,
gonna have to.
that
I'm
was
gonna have to.
so funny.
Don't just give us. The
I'm gonna have to
general
wait a couple of-
category. Just give us the general category. Tommy, you have one. You have one that you can.
I have to wait though.
I'll give you.
Don't
I'll give
wait,
you.
though.
You know what we should do? 20 questions. You're gonna ask me, you try to guess what gun it is, and then I'm gonna reveal how wrong you were. So, yeah.
So Tommy, you can do it with your newest addition to your collection.
Wait,
I
tell me
could.
what's
It's
oh,
it-
no, I know what you okay.
You know exactly what
I
I'm
was
like,
gonna
Garrett.
say, like, no,
I can do it with mine because I haven't revealed it either. So
it is.
But-
Speaking of 7.62 by
I was
54
gonna say,
R.
it isn't.
Hey, speaking of that ammo, Matt, this weekend, you can have us in off you, so we can go shoot this. You act like I carry this type of ammo. Give me like 20 rounds, bro.
Oh man, maybe. Oh, actually, you know what?
Fine, fuck, dude. We'll
I
stop.
should go-
No, we'll just stop it.
I'll
at
throw up a
gunshot.
picture.
It's cool. It's
I'll-
whatever.
I'll throw up a picture of it, post, but I'll show how big the 7.62 by 54R is.
It's a spicy boy.
It's a nice round.
Ballistics on 7.62 by 54 are kind of interesting. Because I watched that Grantham video where he took
Doesn't 308 shoot a little flatter?
308 is just better in my mind than pretty much every other round with 308.
Okay, 7.62
Bro,
by
that
54R is the longest serving.
You know,
round in
but
history.
you wanna
You're
wanna
right
laugh.
about that, actually, but the
I know.
ballistics,
I know I'm right.
ballistics. I'm pretty sure. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tommy. Anyone who's listening, I don't think the ballistics are as good on 7.62 by 54R as 308.
I'm pretty sure 308 shoots flatter.
I'm pretty sure it is because once you
You
get
know
up
what,
to like
they may
700,
not be-
800 yards, I'm pretty sure that 54R is going to start getting unstable.
Yeah.
If I remember that right.
Yeah, but you can say what you want about it, but the fact that the Russians are still using it currently in their conflict with Ukraine right now.
I'm currently using it too.
We gotta pop that.
Mayor.
We gotta pop that video you took right now.
Oh my God! Him getting flicked in the face.
I'll put that in for that episode though.
Yeah, for sure.
No, but I want to go back to the Finnish. I want to go back to the Finnish Mosins real quick because the Finnish Mosin Nagants, especially the Sako M39s, are about as perfect as you can make a Mosin Nagant without taking away the features that make it a Mosin, which I find incredible because they're not that expensive. All things considered, they're slightly more expensive than like a Russian or a Chinese-made Mosin Nagant, which to me is hilarious because they're the best Mosins out there.
Russian, Chinese, just inherent.
Yep,
I have to say it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But also going back to, I can't believe I almost forgot to show this as well. But I want to go back to Garrett's Mosin real quick. So his New England Westinghouse Mosin. The interesting story about those in particular is that when Westinghouse signed the contract to start making these guns, Westinghouse needed basically an entire facility in order to manufacture the firearms in the first place. So rather than waste 8 months building a new facility, they bought a facility from a small regional manufacturer up in the Northeast called Meridian Arms. And I actually happen to have a Meridian 30 caliber revolver that was sick. One of their old 1904
is that
top
breaks?
breaks?
Is that top break one, Tommy?
Yep, this was my this. I mean, it is absolutely beat to. It is absolutely beat to hell. It will not function. I would actually be kind of terrified trying to shoot 38 long out of this or 32 long out of this, whatever it shoots. But it's just a cool piece of history because my dad and I spent hours trying to figure out what this little logo on it was. Because it was one of my grandfather's old revolvers, and my uncle tried to tell me it was a Colt, and I'm like, Colt never made top breaks like this. So we finally figured out who it was, and when I was doing some subsequent research just for this episode, I discovered that they bought the manufacturing facility, and because the company used to be owned by Sears Roebuck. But I just think it's one of those cool little pieces of history that like you dive into, you start reading about some of these guns, and you're like, wow, that is.
Mm-hmm. For sure. What, Tommy? You said New England Westinghouse made how many of these approximately, or just in general?
So,
how many of those did the Americans make on that Russian contract?
So, if I remember correctly, based off the numbers that were in total produced by Remington and Westinghouse, it was about 1.7 million out of a total of 3.7 million ordered.
Okay, so Westinghouse made 1.7, right? So I got
Westinghouse made about.
That's what mine is.
That sounds about right because
it's pretty late, 1915. That's what it's stamped at. So
that's nice.
It sounds about right because so Westinghouse, in terms of the guns produced that were actually shipped to Russia before the Civil War starts, was about 1.15, 1.12 million, and then after the Russian government collapses, they still produced about 300,000 rifles because the Americans kind of picked up the cost to prevent the collapse of the arms industry by the sudden end of the war. And then some of those guns would have then been sold off to the Russian White Army and the Czech Legion, like I said. And again, want some really fun, fascinating reading? Czech Legion is probably they're the most badass volunteer corps ever.
Wow.
What makes them so badass, Tommy? Tell me.
They fought.
Probably will not research it.
So to make it before getting in, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but to make it very easy, they were a volunteer corps of Czechs, as the name implies, who had fled the Austro-Hungarian Empire during the First World War to fight with the Russians in the hopes that once the empire was defeated, they would get their own what would become Czechoslovakia, but at least they were hoping to establish their homeland. And you saw this with a lot of different ethnic groups during the war. The Poles did it, the Czechs did it, the Ukrainians did it because they were hoping that if the Russian Empire collapses, they would have their own country. The Armenians, although that's a very touchy subject to certain people, we won't get into. But after the Russian government collapses and the communists take over and pull Russia out of the war, the Czechs are kind of left marooned, so they spend a year and a half fighting across Russia, fighting the Greens, fighting the Reds, fighting... And I'm using these terms because that's what they were called, the communists, the anarchists, for those who are unaware of the terminology. But they were all these different political factions. So the Czechs were basically all by themselves. So they fought all the way across Russia from the Eastern Front near like the Romanian and Polish border to Vladivostok, which is 4,500 miles, something like that, something ridiculous. They fight all the way there. They get to Vladivostok. They meet one of the White Army commanders, this Russian admiral, I think Alexander or Constantine. Yeah, there's a Russian movie about him, actually. Very fascinating story. They get there, and then there are Allied forces that arrive. And they're like, well, we can take you home, or you can stay and fight. We brought weapons for you. So the Czechs actually take the guns, some of them those Mosin Nagants made by Remington and Westinghouse, and then turn around and go fighting back the other direction across Russia again.
Tommy, I take back everything I said. I want to read about these people.
It's one of the coolest stories I've ever read, and basically all of them went on to serve either in the newly formed Czechoslovakian army or as the general staff following World War I, and they would build the modern military of Czechoslovakia. So, and they almost could have been put to good use in 1938 had the British not gotten involved. Damn you, Chamberlain. For those on this podcast, we don't respect most British politicians here. At least I don't. I don't know about the rest of you.
What do you mean most?
Oh god. Any foreign politician.
Yeah. But
or
all in all,
I was gonna say.
Yeah, that's right.
I didn't
for foreign.
I didn't want to be the one to say it about politics.
But all in all, I think so long ago when I first encountered the Mosin, I've always been a Mauser fanboy. I love Mausers. I had two. I now have one. They're just better systems. But when you really stop and think about like the Mosin Nagant itself, especially that 1891 date on it, you then kind of realize that it's a very early gun, because at the time, the only guns that were competing with it were early generation Mausers, which were nowhere near as good as they would become. So the Mosin in some cases was actually better. Early British Lee Metfords, which were not very good. This Carcano rifle that I keep showing every now and then, which in and of itself was kind of fine. The 6.5 and some of the barrel mechanics leave a lot to be desired. And that's really about it. Well, and then, of course, the Americans with the Krag Jorgensen. But the Krag is really a hunting rifle masquerading as a military rifle. I'm just going to say that right now. I know there are people who love to shoot with them. Even nowadays, people go hunting with old surplus guns that they've sporterized. But the Americans really, really messed up with that adoption.
Tommy, how do you feel about those old hunting guns that are sporterized? I know you have spices
God.
on some of them.
Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Fire from the hip. No.
Oh, man.
We'll explain if and when we decide to cover the MP40. We'll discuss that. We'll discuss that story for the audience.
I'm sure we'll cover it, Tommy. I know you love that thing, man.
Range officer teleports behind our friend.
I can feel the range officer breathing on my neck. God.
I told him, just the greatest thing. How do you hold this thing? From the mag well. Don't fire from the hip. Fire from the hip.
Fire from the hip. What?
Oh my god, it was absolutely
I love
terrible.
RSOs so much. One of the reasons I refuse to shoot at an actual range.
You get such a weird mix. RSOs are just you know what they are?
You can
they're
get a good one,
like,
but I feel like most of them are
it's kind of like buying Russian surplus. You never know what you're gonna get. You could get really pristine and really good, or really bad. It just depends.
Dude, it's really funny because I'll be scrolling on Instagram and stuff, and obviously I follow a lot of firearm people, and then you'll see like who's tagged in these photos, and you'll click on their profile thing, and you're like, oh, this person has some cool guns, whatever they do, breakdowns, whatever, cool videos. Nah, dude, it's like I'm a certified RSO. Right, and you would think that is the last thing they are, or that they even should be. So
I will say the guys up at the Prescott Gun Club. Well, I lived up there for a few years. Those guys are phenomenal.
Yeah, no, most of them are legit.
Well, because they're running in a smaller town type deal, so they don't have to be as crazy. And they're just really cool guys, really about all the education, all that
It's
stuff.
not your typical.
Shout out to you guys because
Yeah,
I really
sure.
enjoy shooting.
Yeah,
with you
look,
guys.
It's
again,
not
we're
your
not-
typical big city range though. That's what I'm saying,
We're-
bro. Like, in a
we're
lot of these
not
bigger
saying-
ranges- Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that's I was going to say, Garrett, you make a great point about not the big ranges, but we're not saying all RSOs. We're just saying they're a mixed bag, and depending on where you go,
There's
because I've
bad
met some
hats in
great
every
RSOs.
profession. Right.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, man. Tommy, what else do you want to cover on this Mosin?
Well, I really wish we could get our hands on a Russian sniper variation because I would love nothing more than to talk all day long about how that is.
I really wish we could too, Tommy. So,
Well, I have
That
different
is-
sniper variation.
stay tuned.
I keep
Stay
saying
tuned.
leaking
But the really-
Someone's
I
gonna
will
piece
say
it
this,
together,
though.
I know
Someone
that.
already. A lot of
Oh, people
I'm
already
sure that
have.
you
I
can
guarantee
use
you they have.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is, I'd be willing to make the argument that the 1903 Springfield with a scope or German K98s with optics, the Russians really cement, in my opinion at least, the Russians with the Mosin sniper variation, with the PU scope, really cement this idea of the squad marksman or the squad sniper role. Because especially when you had things like the Battle of Stalingrad, Kharkov, things like that, the city type of fighting, the need to have a soldier with a dedicated rifle for range and accuracy really begins to make a lot of sense, because if everybody's armed with submachine guns or semi-autos or scopeless bolt actions, but you're getting shot at from a rooftop, it helps to have that ability to reach out and touch someone. And I would make the argument that of all of the, especially the World War II variations of sniper rifles, if you will, the MRs, whatever you want to call them, I would say the Mosin PU sniper variation was probably the best one for it, because all of the Kar 98s that you see with like the 12 power telescopic sights, those were custom jobs. Like you had soldiers who would have those scopes shipped from home to be fitted to their guns. And the Germans did experiment with some more like 3 and 4 power scopes like the ZF-41, but even then, like, the Germans never made use of that squad sniper role. The Americans tried, because you got the 1903 and then the M1 Garand C and D variations, but those weren't very common either. The Russians were really the only ones who cemented this idea of the squad sniper. And it's a really good idea, especially for modern combat scenarios. And I mean, hell, even nowadays, I've seen pictures in Ukraine of Russians, of Ukrainians equipped with Russian Mosin sniper configuration rifles. And it seems kind of sad because in a modern combat scenario with main battle tanks and stuff, I don't know if I'd want a World War I bolt action. Just a preference thing.
If it's what you have, then it's what you use.
It's like the
But
SpongeBob episode with All Reliable. They like go.
Isn't that?
Yeah.
Oh my God. That's funny. But
I mean, but that is also kind of the thing. The Russians have always been of the opinion, if it works and it's not, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And again, the Mosin wasn't broke. The Mosin just wasn't perfect. But the Russians have never needed anything to be perfect to get the job done. I think the last 100 years have shown that.
it works. It works.
Well, they just throw bodies at the problem until the problem solves. So.
Well, it's such a typical. So this story is 100% false, but it's my favorite. It's my favorite comedy story that sums up the difference between the Soviet Union and NATO and the United States. The story goes that during the space race, the Americans were trying to figure out how to do research and take notes and writing and stuff in zero gravity. Mm-hmm. So they contracted this major pen corporation to develop a pen that would work in zero gravity. And after 3 or 5 years of development and millions of dollars spent, they successfully build a pen that will work in zero gravity. It doesn't need gravity to, activate to let the ink fall. The Russians just used a pencil.
Yep.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it, dude.
There's no reason to the Russians have always been like, there's no reason to overcomplicate the matter. Just keep it simple, stupid.
And sometimes you beat me to it. Damn it, Tommy.
Keep it simple, stupid.
I was literally about to say it. So.
Emphasis on the stupid part, Garrett.
So, Tommy, give us your final thoughts on the Mosin Nagant, and maybe a follow-up episode with some bonus clips for some special content.
So,
we could do some videos on
there's so much. Yeah, there's so much to talk about. We can get some actual.
Yeah,
So
actually,
with the limited,
this weekend.
with the limited experience that I have with the Mosin, I will say that I like them. I think the Mosin is an overall a good system. I think after having done the research that I have, I developed a greater appreciation for this system because again, if you don't understand the why for something, you're just going to completely write it off. Like again, if you know nothing about the development of the Mosin Nagant, nothing about the gun makes sense. Whether it's whether it's the round locking lugs because of the way the cartridge feeds, the weird magazine, the rail on the bolt, the the bayonet sighting, none of it makes sense. But when you take all of that context into consideration, it really does. I mean, I'm going to show it again. The Carcano rifle is effectively...
He wants to do an episode on the Carcano. I'm hearing it.
You don't say.
Effectively, this gun was a Mannlicher magazine bolted to a needle fire conversion system for the old Italian breech loaders. I mean, this action is very simple, but it's what the Italians could get away with making. Whereas the Russians, you can clearly see, actually put a lot of time and effort into developing a system that would do exactly what they wanted it to do. And I think in that sense, you've got to give them credit because, again, especially in the early 1890s, there aren't a lot of great smokeless powder repeating rifles available. Like I said, you've got the Mauser 89 to 91 series that would be used in Argentina and in South America. The Ottomans would adopt a variation of the 1890, but this is far from the Mauser 98 and export models that we all know and love today, or even like my Yugo M48. The Lee Metford and the American Remington Lee is still in development. It's not a perfect system, not to mention nobody is ever going to be equipping those things with the multiple detachable box mags on it anyway, so you can't make use of the system. And then in Austria, you've got these straight pull rifles, but the Austrians are using old wedge lockers. They won't even get their high quality straight pull 95 repeaters until years down the line. So for what the Mosin was at the time of its adoption, it's actually a great rifle. We may laugh at it now, even though some people will sing its praises till they're blue in the face. Mosin fanboys can be kind of annoying, at least in my opinion. I've met a couple. They're a very dedicated bunch. Let's put it that way. Hey, they're kind of like AK guys.
Give them props, man. If you're that dedicated to it,
sure.
That doesn't mean I agree. It doesn't mean I agree.
Everyone's got their favorite gun. So
yeah, exactly.
What are your final thoughts, Garrett?
My final thoughts is, Tommy, thank you for the absolute knowledge dump because I truly didn't even know what I had in my safe. Dude, I mean, a lot of cool information, especially about that magazine, that bolt. For
the audience watching, I mean, as I told to Garrett today, he's sitting on a Mosin Nagant that is easily worth 2 to 3 times the cost of a regular Russian Mosin.
I had no idea.
What'd you get for it?
$3.99. Dude,
he literally was gifting.
Wow. I got this and like 6 other antique firearms that I'm sure we'll do future episodes on.
Yeah.
So some cool old side-by-side Damascus Tiger Strike barrel coach gun.
Tommy's going to see. Tommy's going to skip. Is that the limited 18?
Tommy's going to be shaking some of this stuff, bro. So yeah, no, I got it for free. So it's good to know what I'm sitting on now.
That's exciting.
Kind of a little gem that I didn't know about.
It may or may not be spirited away back to Narnia with me when I leave next week.
Tommy, you would never be able to steal something from me, brother.
$10.
$20.
It's a $20 profit.
Yeah, hey, I made $20 off of it. So yeah, final thoughts, man. This thing's awesome. I'm glad I know what I'm sitting on now. So.
Wow, I just can still think back to when you told me about it. You're like, yeah, it's like some 1913 Russian Mosin cavalry. It's pretty cool. I'm like, oh, that's sick, and I have an idea of what it is. And then he sends me the picture of the receiver today. I'm like, I'm going to hurt you. I was so angry. I was so upset because it you know what it is, and it's exactly what I told the Garrett. It's that situation where like your relative who fought in World War II or whatever passes away. He's got all these guns in his gun locker, but you have no idea what they are, so you just sell them for pennies on the dollar. You're like, oh, it's just...
You hate to see it. But this next weekend, Tommy, you get to fire the inaugural first rounds of God knows how
I still can't believe you...
We'll
Dude,
get
I still can't
whatever
believe you
hooks
never
is
shot
gold,
it.
Man, I'm not gonna fire it until I fully break it down and know that it's not gonna blow up in my face. I'd rather it blow up in your face than mine. So there you go. No,
Me
you're
shooting
you're
this thing
the
as soon
first
as I
round,
got it
boy.
without a care in the world.
We'll be sure to get some clips this weekend for it. I definitely want to do either some kind of additional little video, just to highlight just how it shoots and all that stuff. We can just
Show that action working.
Yeah, do some groupings and all that stuff. I'm super excited, but
Oh, it's gonna be great.
so until next time, I think we're
Until
good.
next week, guys. Everyone, thanks for
Stay
watching.
tuned. There's gonna be some cool stuff coming.
Oh, absolutely.
M20 Super Bazooka, a bunch of block stuff. Stay tuned, everybody.